in burials. So when the pharaoh died, like I said, they became Osiris. They were no longer Horus. They transformed in death into the great god. They actually had to go through a journey, a very harrowing journey, and there were all sorts of instructions and tools for them to go into the afterlife that they were buried with. These royal burials have their foundation, their roots in the pre-dynastic era. We actually see some of the hints that these smaller scale kings of their own little localities were already sort of moving in this direction, which may hint that the divinity of a pharaoh actually predated the dynastic period. So for instance, in Abydos, there were burials in what were called mastabas. And this actually just means, mastaba means bench in Arabic. And these were bench-like tombs that were built for kings. They were made of big blocks of stone. They were quite elaborate, and they were built away from the Nile Valley. You didn't want to use that good land, but on the edge of the desert, away from people. Also, your soul traveled to the west, so they were usually off in that direction to give you a little bit of a head start. It was probably well known from if people dying out in the desert that corpses get preserved by arid conditions. You can dry out and desiccate and become a mummy just on your own. And so this knowledge imbued a sense of permanence to the body in Egyptian ideas. They thought that your body survived. And so they tried to implement ways to help preserve your body so your loved one that was deceased would actually make it to the afterlife in a good form. And of course, for the pharaoh, that was extremely important. You wanted that pharaoh to have their body preserved. And you also thought that because their body was preserved, you also need to give them things like servants, often in forms of effigy models, what are called figurines and things, ushabti figurines, and also provisions, food and things are left for you. Also instructions and incantations and spells and all sorts of things are left in the tomb for you to have an easier transformation into the afterlife. Some of the earliest royal tombs at Hierakonpolis at the end of the pre-dynastic period were made semi-subterranean of mud brick, and they have some crude wall paintings with all sorts of activities and boats and things like that. Also some little labels, probably for commodities of things, with indicating what was in bags or baskets and that sort of thing. In the first and second dynasties, you start to get these more large-scale brick chambers in the ground, these mastaba tombs, sometimes with some subterranean chambers as well. And they're filled with earth, so you can't get into them, because people knew, Egyptians knew that there was stuff buried with people, and maybe they wanted them. If you were going into your afterlife, you wanted your best jewelry to be with you, right? So thieves who didn't really care about the souls of your loved ones were like, all right, I'm going to jump in that tomb and steal it. So tombs became more elaborate in terms of trying to prevent thieves from getting the stuff that was buried with the deceased. And for pharaohs, of course, that was extremely important. They wanted protection, but they also wanted people to be able to come and remember them. They weren't just beloved by their family members, as being the great house, which was probably large, but also they were at least assuming that they were doing a good job of ruling over people. They were a living god, so other people might love them and might want to come and visit their grave. So they wanted markers. They wanted some type of monumental tombs. And so tombs started to get larger and larger and larger. And I've said this before with monumental architecture in previous lectures, that it's not really the question about how people built these things. We may never know every single thing about the construction techniques, but that's not really that important. How did they lift this block or that block? They did it. A lever, as Archimedes said, give me a lever long enough and I can lift the earth. Simple technology can do all sorts of things. How do you make a straight line? Well, you take a string and you pull it tight. How do you make something flat? Well, water responds to gravity too. You can make a level just with water. There's all sorts of simple tools that can make pretty amazing constructions based on simple technology. But it's the will to do it, the effort to do it. And no, there were no slaves involved in building the pyramids. In fact, quite the opposite. Think of it more in terms of like building a medieval cathedral. You're proud to work on it. You're skilled. The people who built medieval cathedrals are like, look at that, I built that. Isn't that great? Now, you don't question that because we're a little bit closer in time and we understand the ethos of building a church or something like that. But it's really a similar sort of a setup, that this was part of their religion, this was their belief system in Egypt. You would be proud to partake in the construction of a pyramid or a tomb for the living god Pharaoh, even before they're dead. Saying, I'm going to get this ready for you. I'm going to show you a good project, and you will actually be fairly compensated for it, as we'll see here. So some of the earliest royal tombs we see progressing into the early dynastic period are both an expression by people of their pride for their newly emerging government, and but also a sense of pride in their way of life and belief system. In Abydos, King Aha had an enclosure that was destroyed, probably to protect it, but other burials of sacrifices of humans and animals were done there. And a fleet of boats were also interred, probably for the journey to the afterlife. These are solar barks, not ones that were intended to be on water, although they probably were built for that purpose, but this is to take your soul through the solar river. And Saqqara, King Djoser, and this very famous stepped pyramid, this was the attempt to get higher and higher, probably representing the original mounds of creation that are part of Egyptian mythology, and it was originally a mastaba, and so we know that these mastabas were these bench-shaped tombs were basically just being stacked one on top of one another, and they were at Saqqara, the Djoser stepped pyramid seems to have been built in sequence. So there were steps added after one another. The first true pyramid is of King Snefru, so-called the bent pyramid, because they had 3 different attempts to build it, and they had the angles wrong and it kept collapsing on them. So as they got to a certain point, they realized they actually couldn't have that much weight on the top, so it has a little bend in it, a carenation that goes up at this angle and then it has to change to this angle. And we know that I said that the pharaoh has a job to do. Well, the job is divine in some cases. They're not just running the government, they're not just the figurehead, but they also have to do, literally, they have to run obstacle courses. There's the so-called Sed festival, which is their way of dealing with an imperfect calendar, which we do with a leap year these days. But they had a festival. Sounds kind of fun, to way to fix the calendar, because it's not exactly 365 days, it's like 365 and a quarter days. And so you've got to have a leap year every year, or every 4 years that we have, but they added just a few days on the end of each year where they would have a festival that would fix the calendar. And the pharaoh would literally run an obstacle course that showed that was a sort of a representation of what the pharaoh was doing spiritually in terms of fighting off the forces of evil and restoring balance to the world, maintaining this cosmic order. And so the pharaoh is the only one who can do this because this is a living God. So once again, it's cosmology. It's the state formation in Egypt is bringing not just a new economy, a new political structure, a new identity, but also a way of thinking about the world, the way the world is structured. Now remember what I first said, the red land, the black land. This is a sort of a sense of on and off switches. This is very typical of Egyptians. They were very black and white in their, you either were this or you were that. It was either good or it was bad. The nuances were negotiated by the order, and so the pharaoh was in that position of maintaining balance and order. And you trusted in the pharaoh, and maybe you didn't trust because people would go to the festival and watch the pharaoh run through this obstacle course, which demonstrated how they were actually fighting off the forces of evil and that sort of thing. So it's pretty interesting. And actually at Saqqara, there is a course. This obstacle course is replicated. There's a hidden complex where the pharaoh would have run through this. And then we move to the very famous Giza pyramids. So we've seen some attempts at pyramid building, and they came from these bench-shaped tombs that were stacked on top of one another, and then the bent pyramid. They tried to make smooth-sided pyramids, but they got the angles not quite right. And then in the 4th dynasty, meaning these are houses that have taken over from one another, so the 4th dynasty pharaohs created some very well-built pyramids that still exist today. Manetho calls these pharaohs Cheops, Khephren, and Mycerinus. Their real Egyptian names are Khufu, Khephren, and Menkaure. And the pyramid complex, it was built over generations because they were for different pharaohs. The first of these was Cheops's or Khufu's. This is the Great Pyramid. This is the largest pyramid that was built in Egypt as well. And it would have been originally had limestone casings. The facing stones would have been gleaming white. Only a few of them are left. And it also would have had a gold benben stone at the top. And it has hidden chambers inside, of course, to protect the pharaoh's burial place, and that were of very hard stone and very skilled craftspeople to make them. It's all about the permanence of the burial. Of course, it didn't work. It was raided multiple times, also by archaeologists, and so the sarcophagi were raided, and presumably whatever was in the tomb was long gone by the time archaeologists got to it. The second pyramid was Khepren's pyramid, which is similar in size. It doesn't quite look like it because Khufu's pyramid is only slightly larger, but it's situated in a place that makes it look much larger than Khufu's. And it also was encased in polished limestone. And this is when the Sphinx was built, during this. And we know that it was built at that time because there's all sorts of causeways and other structures that link it to it, that it can only really have been built at that time. So set aside any of these crazy pseudo hypotheses about that it's much earlier. It doesn't make any sense in terms of the architecture and the construction sequence. It's not possible to have been built at another time. And then there's Menkaure or Mycerinus's pyramid, which was the third and the last pyramid. It's the smallest as well, and it was partially encased in polished granite, somewhat different, but harder to work stone. And its temple contained, that was associated with, contained beautiful sculptures as well. And importantly, we know who built this. This wasn't, like I said, it wasn't slaves. This is from the middle of the third millennium, so about the middle of 2450, something like that, BC. We have found, archaeologists have found the workshop, or the houses of the workers and their workshops. We found their tools, how they built this. So this isn't really a great mystery about how or who built it. You wouldn't question if you found the workshop and the house of a cathedral builder in France from the medieval period. You wouldn't say, oh, I don't believe that. Of course, that's believable. Well, we found that same thing here in Egypt, just adjacent to on the Giza Plateau. We found evidence for the engineering, the materials, how well they were compensated, what kind of diet the workers had. They actually had a pretty good, they were compensated really well for working on this. They weren't slaves, they weren't, they were skilled workers. In fact, they wanted the best people to build these pyramids. They didn't want some half-done job. That's not good enough for the pharaoh, who's a living god. Now, this sort of, we see pyramids start to fall out toward the end of the Old Kingdom, out of fashion, but this system of honoring pharaohs and the god king continues along until the late Bronze Age, so 1,000 years later, more than 1,000 years after the pyramids were built. We have a pharaoh, Akhenaten, who has some new ideas in his head. We've seen that Horus and Osiris and Ra, the sun god, are important figures in pharaonic mythology and belief systems. But Akhenaten, who is the father of Tutankhamun, he had some different ideas. And those ideas were that he started worshiping a new cult of the sun disk, the representation of the sun as just a disk. And this isn't that radical of an idea on its own, because ancient Egypt had lots of gods. There were gods for beer and wine. There were gods for the river. There were gods for the sky and the stars. There were gods and goddesses for animals, and almost everything had some kind of a representative patron god, including locations, and your own families had special patron gods. But so the sun disk, the Aten as it's called, wasn't unusual. It was, the unusual thing is that Akhenaten said, forget all those other ones. I really only want you to worship the Aten. So, and I'm in charge, so I get to say that. Now, what this did was it put a lot of priests out of work. And so there were a lot of upset people, not necessarily because the Aten was being worshipped, but because they weren't allowed to practice their traditional beliefs. So it was that the Aten was being worshipped at the exclusion of all of these others. And to reinforce this was a period of great power and wealth, the late Bronze Age. This was probably the most powerful civilization on Earth at the time, in the late Bronze Age. And so Akhenaten, being the king, the pharaoh, the god king of in Egypt, could kind of do what he wanted. He had a lot of resources. So he picked up sticks and he moved to a new purpose-built city that he built called Akhet-Aten, or the horizon of the Aten, which we now call Tel El Amarna, is the modern name of the site. And Amarna was only inhabited during his moment in time, in the what we call the Amarna period, in fact, and that's when Akhenaten was shaking things up. And it's an interesting case study. It's been excavated over 100 years or so, and we found archives and letters from other kings. It's very interesting. I don't have enough time to go into all of the stuff going on in the Amarna period, but it reads like the Habsburgs in Europe, and this person marrying the daughter of this king to create an alliance against this other king who they both hate. There's a lot of really interesting stuff in the letters that we've found, mostly written in Akkadian on tablets. And this new city only really lived as long as its pharaoh Akhenaten did. And so he was, after Akhenaten died, all of the city was abandoned, Akhet-Aten, the Tel El Amarna, and all of his religious reforms, where you were exclusively going to worship the Aten, that was all rejected and overturned and reversed. And the priests who are now reclaiming power after Akhenaten died, which his name means beloved of the Aten, they said, get rid of any reference to Akhenaten. So you have the Memorio Damnatii, the sort of the death of the memory of this character. So all of the depictions and images of Akhenaten, wherever they could find them, they scratched out his face or his name or anywhere you could find it. It's rare, even though they do exist. It's more common to find smashed statues of Akhenaten, because there was a real iconoclasm about this. A complete reversal. The art style was rejected, monuments were smashed, broken up, the city was abandoned, and Egypt returned to what it had done ever since the start of the Old Kingdom. So it's quite interesting, because we don't get very many cities from the Old Kingdom. So Tel El Amarna shows us because it was a single period site and it was never reoccupied, there was not a lot of reworking. It was just abandoned and left. And so we found this time capsule. Whereas I've been talking about temples and tombs,